The very first question most Tarkov players have to answer is whether to play Bear or USEC, and the game gives you almost no information as to how to make that choice whatsoever. The differences between the two factions doesn't actually matter that much in the grand scheme of things, but there are quite a lot of subtle factors as to why you would choose one versus the other. The most important of these being that you can party up with players from the other faction. There are no restrictions on that like there are in some other games. And I remember being frozen with worry that my friends might pick a different faction to me and then we wouldn't be able to play together. But this is not the case. You can play with anybody from USEC or Bear regardless of which faction you are. Next is your initial loadout. In the long run, what you get when you start, either as a Bear or USEC, doesn't really matter because it will only last you for probably the first week or maybe two, and you're going to be upgrading this stuff from there anyway, but it does influence how you play the game at its early stages. What you're looking for in Raid to enhance what you get given at the beginning will differ depending on whether you're Bear or USEC, so let's have a look at what you start with. So what we're looking at here is an EOD account starting as USEC. I have not moved anything or touched anything in this account at all. This is exactly how it is when you load into the game at the moment in patch 14.9.5. So some of these things do change when you load into new patches, but this hasn't changed for a little bit. They did start making a difference between USEC and Bear, quite a few years ago, but a lot of the starting gear is about the same. So the things you'll notice originally is that you get this ammo, M882, which is a 9mm bullet. Now that you have the penetration and damage stats in game, you can see this one is 18 pen and 56 damage, which is slightly worse than the Bear equivalent. They get PST for the 9mm pistols, but it's basically the same as far as in-game performance actually goes. You then get a couple of MP5s. You can buy 30 rounders for these straight away, so there's not really any point using these little MP5 20 rounders instead. And then we scroll down and we get some more USEC specific stuff like the M4, which obviously a Bear wouldn't get. And one of the main buffs that you get as a USEC is actually having a bunch of these bullets here. You get a ton of Stanag magazines, and all of these are full of 855, which is not that bad at the beginning of the wipe. 31 pen means it'll go through pretty much everyone's armor until they're using class 4, and 57 damage is really decent. So if you look in the actual stash, you have like 330 M855s, and then you actually have even more in all these magazines as well. You get a few other bits and pieces with EOD specifically. You get the trooper armor, the AVS, you get this MDR, which is really strong to start the wipe with. And other than that, the sniper rifle you're given is the M700. You get a little ring mount and this optic, which is really not one of the good ones at all, but you can technically put the sniper rifle together at the beginning of the game. And then you get given some M80 as well. You've got some more in these magazines too. So we can see how much we've actually got in total is 80 and then probably 90 in total, which like M80 is a very powerful round. Other than this, most of the stuff is probably going to be about the same, so we'll swap over to Bear to take a look. And the way I did this was I did it on my PvE account on my separate account. So I actually have two accounts. I have one account, which is my main account, where I have regular and PvE, and then I have a separate account that I actually won at the BSG competition like 5 years ago or something, and that is also EOD, and that has the main PvP account and the EOD account. And I haven't really touched those accounts, so that's why we're able to look at these right now without me having to reset my stuff or anything like that. Alright, so now we're over on the Bear account at level 1. So you can see most of the stuff is pretty much the same. What do you get given this time? Rather than MP5s, you have the PP19. Depends whether you prefer this one or the other weapon. Slower fire rate, but a bit more accurate in terms of recoil handling. If we scroll down, the weapon that you get here is not disassembled like it is on the USEC side, but you get the SV98. And inside this, you get some bullets here. So let's have a look at what's inside the SV98. It's probably LPS or something. Yeah, it's LPS. So you have 50 LPS in the stash, and then you've got another 30 there, and a little bit more in the gun. So, probably 80 or 90 again, like we had with M80. LPS is pretty powerful. It's like a decent round early for the SV98. Now, obviously, being a Bear, you get some slightly different guns as well. So you get the AK-12. So these ones fire 545 rather than 556 from the USEC versions. And you get the AK-74M as well. Now, you get quite a bit of ammunition. So if we unload this, you can see that these mags are pretty much all filled with PS. I think they've all got PS in them. But when we go on our magazine itself, we can see that we not only have PS, but we also have BP. Now, it's interesting that you start with 90 rounds of BP. BP used to not be as good as it is now. And if you go and look at the penetration stats on this thing, it is 45 pen and 46 damage. BP is kind of the endgame bullet for this particular caliber. It would be a little bit like starting with 90 rounds of M855A1 at the beginning on USEC, which you do not do. So you have a little bit of an advantage playing Bear in terms of the ammunition, because you can top load. I wouldn't do it straight away, but after a week or two in the wipe, you can start top loading this stuff and you'll beat class 4 very easily. Helmets or body armors like this, you'll kill PMCs very easily using this ammunition, so it's quite useful to save up a little bit of it. On EOD, you get the A8 M1 rig, which is not half bad. This is kind of equivalent to the USEC Trooper. The Trooper doesn't get side plates in it though, whereas the M1 rig does, which is kind of neat. Not that you can buy those at the beginning of the game anyway. And other than that, the stuff is pretty much the same. So you can see like most of the things are pretty similar. As I said before, you get PST, which is 20 pen rather than 18 on Bear. Bear typically has slightly better ammunition, but the stock weapons are arguably slightly worse because of lower time to kill. So the PP19 has a 700 RPM fire rate rather than the MP5's 800 and the MP5K's 900. You got the AK-74M, which is a 650 fire rate versus the M4's 800. So you kind of get a bit better ammo, but the guns are kind of worse as like a base platform. If you go onto the Tarkov website itself, you can actually on the pre-order page expand out what you get for each one, and so you can see what you get from a standard account versus unheard, which is the edition above mine and also the edition below mine on standard. And you can see that the differentiation here between Bear and USEC, you can see what you get. The most important parts being, as we were talking about before, the MP5's 2 pieces versus the PP19 2 pieces. And also a little bit further down, you got the M4 versus the AK-74M. And then in terms of ammunition, this is what we just looked at: 180 pieces of M855 versus 545 PS in 120, but then you also get this 90 of BP as well. So that's where you can see the differences for standard. If you move up from EOD, which is no longer purchasable, up to the Unheard Edition, which I don't have, then you also get a whole bunch of other stuff, as we know, like a weapons case, the Lucky Scav junk box, and an ammo case at the beginning, which is a huge leg up, as well as the MP7, the Scar L, an SR25, some mags for these different guns, as well as an Eclipse plate carrier, which is class 4, and you also get 1 million rubles rather than 500,000 to start with, as well as M80, M8561, and some JSP for the MP7. Over on the Bear side, it is much the same, except you get an SR2M instead, an AK-105, and an SVD. You get the magazines for those particular guns, and you start with some 7.62 by 54 RPS, which is a very good bullet, as well as 545 by 39 BT, which is actually worse than BP, interestingly, and then some bullets BT for the SR2M, which are pretty good as well. So the next most impactful thing about picking Bear versus USEC is how the AI responds to you on certain maps, in particular Lighthouse. Lighthouse is populated by the rogue USEC PMC faction around the water treatment area in the north section of the map, who sees bears in a much less favourable light than they do their USEC counterparts. Practically, this means that the rogues always see bears as hostile and will shoot them on sight, whereas with USEC they will only do so if they get too close or aggro directly by firing at them. If you aggro the rogues as a USEC, their stance towards you resets back to being favourable after playing 3 raids on any map, doesn't have to just be Lighthouse. So this means that the most experienced Lighthouse players on USEC end up fighting the rogues anyway pretty much every time they go to Lighthouse, as they're one of the biggest features of the map, which pretty much removes the difference between Bear and USEC if you're trying to kill them every single time. Earlier in the wipe though, and if you're not really a Lighthouse main, then playing USEC does make these Lighthouse tasks a lot easier, as you can literally do some of the quests at nighttime and run around inside the water treatment facility without taking any of the rogues out at all, which bears unfortunately do not get the same luxury to do. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that BSG have been threatening to add a bear-friendly faction for a very long time. We are expecting this to appear at some point on Streets of Tarkov, and so every wipe that I choose USEC, I'm gambling that they won't add them this wipe. We haven't heard anything about them this time around, but that's not to say that they won't add them as a surprise. This could be anything from the Black Division, which has been teased a few times, through to the regular Russian forces, the RUAF, or even just rogue bears similar to they have on Lighthouse. If they do this at some point, the downside of not being able to play Streets as easily as a USEC could far outweigh the upside of being able to play Lighthouse without aggroing the rogues. That is, if you can play Streets adequately on your PC. We are supposed to be getting some FPS improvements this wipe across every map with patch 15, so hopefully more players will enjoy higher frame rates on Streets to make it playable this time around. In terms of questing, there is one particular task that depends on which faction you are, which is either Our Own Land from Prapor or Counter Action from Peacekeeper, and you only get these tasks depending on which faction you're on. Both of them require you to kill 20 PMCs of the opposing faction on the map Lighthouse, and then hand in 20 PMC dog tags of the other faction as well. As you might imagine from what we spoke about regarding Lighthouse a second ago, most players who play Lighthouse are USEC because it is much easier to get around the map. This then gets overlaid with where you play, and if you're on the Western European servers or US, typically you will find that approximately 60 to 70% of the player base is USEC and 30 to 40% is Bear. The number of bears has been increasing slowly over time, I believe because of this threat of the extra faction, or maybe people just want to try out the other side for a change. But whatever the reason, it is much harder to get the bear kills on Lighthouse for counteraction than it is to get the USEC kills for Our Own Land. One particular strategy for this is if you have the ping, then you can load into the Eastern European servers instead, where the player base is slightly more likely to be playing bear than in the West. You can decide yourself whether this particular task makes it worth going bear over USEC, as the quest doesn't unlock anything else after you finish it. The rewards, however, include the direct purchase of the flashbang shotgun shell for the KS-23, as well as about 20,000 experience. There is another way to make the flashbang shotgun shell round in the workbench, so you're not locked out of doing this, but it makes it a lot easier, in particular for the task where you have to kill PMCs under the flashbang effect, for which the KS-23 flash rounds are probably the best way to do it. Another choice between bear and USEC that is very important to some players is purely around the aesthetics of the clothing options between the two factions. The clothes between the two are different, and many prefer the clothes that you get on the bear side simply in terms of looks. You can either check these out in-game on Ragman's Services tab for your chosen faction, or using the wiki to see all available clothes for both factions in one place. As I said, for some people, this is literally the main reason why they choose one faction over the other, and I suppose the fact that the other reasons are fairly subtle and don't change the experience too much also plays into it. With the addition of VoIP, the in-game voice lines are used a lot less than they used to be. However, it is useful to note that as a USEC, you will have an English-speaking voice line versus bear, where typically the voice lines will all be in Russian instead. A broken English bear voice line was added to the game. In fact, there's two, so if you do want to play bear but with an English voice, then you can do that. But one reason that I've seen around for people choosing a Russian bear voice line, even if you are an English speaker, is that against inexperienced players, you can use the bear Russian voice to trick them into thinking you are a scav. This is clearly not possible with the USEC voice lines, as they are most obviously English.
Other guys saw bears in this area.
The one final thing that I would like to add, which is a complete speculation at this point, is that there is potential for bear to be slightly easier than USEC in terms of PMC karma. We don't know anything really about how PMC karma is going to work in patch 15, but given that there are more USECs than there are bears, typically you'll be facing players of the opposing faction more often if you play on Western servers and choose bear. Whether this is going to have any impact at all, I'm not entirely sure yet. All that we know so far is that sitting near extracts or something like that will tick down your PMC karma, and the new boss Partisan might come after you, but other than this, details are very, very scarce. It's still worth having in the back of your mind though, just in case something does happen. I myself will continue to pick USEC because I'm a USEC main. I enjoy playing as the antagonist, I suppose, in the lore, and I enjoy using the Western guns earlier on in the wipe. So as usual, big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.